Здравствуйте. Как ваши дела?
Спасибо большое. Всем
Давно
хорошо.
не виделись.
Да.
Рад Иванович, здравствуйте.
Здрасте.
Узнали или
Да,
нет, я не
вчера.
знаю.
А я вчера
Нашла
давал
свой...
визитку, да?
Да, визитку дали.
Да,
У меня
всё.
не было визитки.
Я тоже познакомился с Ballroom, наша команда.
О,
Как раз тоже AFC.
сейчас вчера поймала Ивановича немножко...
В лифте.
Да, в лифте. Нельзя расслабляться нигде.
Был elevator pitch.
Да. Инвестирую в воду. Вот. Для меня был хороший сюрприз. Ну, мне кажется или не кажется. Вот, поэтому мне нужно структурировать сделку в Казахстане. Вот, это будет первая сделка. Сейчас мы мгновенно сделаем.
Мы с удовольствием поможем. Вы нам отправьте.
Да. Мне нужно сначала понять, что вы делаете, потому что я пока не поняла, как делать. Вот. Астана AFC я знаю, они тоже вроде бы участвуют. Вот. Но сейчас мне нужна поддержка со всех сторон.
Но мы занимаемся поддержкой. Да, поддержкой стратегическим консалтингом. То есть больше
отлично.
как правило.
Я скоро буду в Астане.
Dear speakers, please take your seats. Dear speakers and guests, thank you all for joining us. Today we discuss Tashkent's potential as an international financial center. And first of all, let me introduce our speaker. Today at our round table we have Ilhom Narkulov, First Deputy Minister, Minister of Economy and Finance of the Republic of Uzbekistan. Atabek Nazirov, Advisor to the Minister of Investments, Industry and Foreign Trade. Charles Henry Hirsch, Chief Investment Advisor at Eurostep Limited. Dr. Kairat Kilimbetov, Founding Governor at Astana International Financial Center. George Parasishvili, Chief Executive Officer at Tashkent Stock Exchange. Adalat Abdunapanova, AHG Advisor Lead for Central Asia at International Finance Corporation. Alfredo De Angelis, Senior Manager, Director at Gapston Group. Andrew Hayes, Managing Partner at Hudson Sandler. Karen Srapionov, Partner at Avesta Investment Group. Robert Jensen, Managing Director at Mosaic Finance. And from London, we have Mike Wardell, Chief Executive Officer at ZTN Group. Dear colleagues, friends, guests, creating an international financial center in Tashkent sits with the heritage of the Republic of Uzbekistan. The ancient cities of Great Silk Road, Samarkand and Bukhara with their trading
50 times in 2000, 2001 was actually a buy proposal because the return to risk ratio was good. Now, fast forward, you go to 2008 or 2011, at some point Gazprom was worth $250 billion. So $250 billion, the upside is only 2 times. That starts to be, so you really need to have very low risks. But the financial infrastructure was not ready in Russia. The company was still not distributing a dividend. And it was the US shale gas revolution in addition, so that didn't help. That was a sell, 2 times. Returns are relatively low, risks are lower, but return to risk ratio was not good. And then let's go a little bit fast forward today. Today, Gazprom is about $2. That's $50 billion market cap. That's a 10, 12 times upside. Is it a good proposal? Where you have war in Russia? Russia invaded Ukraine, but they are reorienting their gas from Europe to Asia, which is a growing market. So risks are seen as very high at the moment in Russia. The price is average, so it's probably a buy in terms of return to risk ratio. You want to buy when pretty much everything is bad, as long as the price is also low. So that this is an introduction, and this is what I'm looking at in Uzbekistan. This return to risk ratio. So you don't want to in Uzbekistan to sell, I mean, as a state, a company at international prices if risks have not been mitigated. The prices that Uzbekistan should expect are low and should be low in comparison to international prices. Otherwise, the return to risk ratio is not good enough. So in terms of, let me go and list those three risks: infrastructure risks, corporate actions risks, and company risk linked to corporate governance. So in terms of infrastructure, what we want to see are three things: property rights. Property rights. So you want to know where your shares are. Then custodian facility, safekeeping of your securities. You want that to be well organized. And finally, trading operations. You don't want to take counterparty risks. So let me go back. Property rights. So if you don't know where your shares are, that's a risk. Your shares could be stolen, they could disappear, you could something bad they can be transferred. So you need to have an independent network of regulated registrars. These registrars are computers, are companies with which are regulated, and it's not the book in some drawer of the CEO or of ministry. That needs to be well organized. It needs to be not corrupt. It needs to be well IT serviced, and it needs to run smoothly. That is, when you transfer a security from Fund A to Fund B, or from A to B, there's no doubt that you own the shares. So whether this is the case in Uzbekistan, I don't know, but this is certainly something to investigate. The second thing is you need to be able to set up your operations in the country, and without a proper network of international and local custodians, it doesn't work. So if the cities, the Northern Trust of the world are not here, that's the SITCos, this is already a problem. And then you have to usually have sub-custodians, so partners here, who are holding the shares. That also needs to exist. Those could be local banks or local institutions, but they also need to be regulated. They need to be licensed by the central bank. And if you don't have this, international investors, funds cannot set shop here because they can't even they're not allowed to invest because they can't technically invest. They don't have a counterpart to talk to. So this is important. This is risk number 2. You need to have this safekeeping custodian organizations working professionally in the country. And the third, in terms of infrastructure, the third risk is linked to when you trade, you don't want to take the counterparty risk. So there needs to be a stock exchange doing the intermediary. If you trade OTC, over the counter, it's a contractual. Then you have lawyers. You understand what you're doing, but it's slow. There's no liquidity, and it becomes a little bit like semi-private equity. But if you buy and sell on the market, well, you want to make sure that when you do a transaction, the other party is not going to default. So you're not ready to take the counterparty risk. You want the broker or the exchange to guarantee that when you pay when you pay some dollars, you're going to receive the shares, and when you deliver the shares, you're going to receive some dollars. So it's easier said than done. In Russia, for instance, it took them 20 years to put that together. It only happened from 2015. I don't know exactly what the status is in Uzbekistan, but certainly taking the counterparty risk when you do a trade is, reduces the return to risk ratio. Second, after this infrastructure risk that Uzbekistan should work on, there is something intermediate, which is the corporate actions risk. So you want to exercise your rights as a shareholder, and that means that you need to have, when there is an AGM, an EGM, a buyback, any corporate action, a new issuance of shares, you want to be in the loop and you want to be able to vote easily. What does that mean? That means that the custodian is going to send you information. So not on paper, electronically, and not in the local language that you don't understand, but in English, and just on time, because otherwise, you don't have the time to assess the situation and to take the proper action. And then you need to be able to effectively vote your shares. And this is what is important, because sometimes there are related party transactions, and as a minority shareholder, you are the only one who can vote, because the majority or the related party doesn't have the right to vote. And if you don't vote, which actually is the case in Russia at the moment, then you're squeezed and you lose value and potentially your shares. So this is very, very important to be able to vote. So here it's a risk which is both linked to how the market is organized and the custodian are organized, but also how the company itself communicates, because they may not be properly regulated, and then they don't have to if they're not in the proper listing. So that's also a problem. Alina, how much time do I have?
So thank you. Very interesting. And let's,
yeah,
Alfredo, please.
Good morning, everyone. So, Charles, did you sell Gazprom when the ratio went down? Or
yeah, I did. Yeah.
Okay, so you want to listen to him, not me, because I didn't sell. I still have them, I think. I don't know where my shares are, but that's the risk you highlighted.
We can talk.
I'm glad I'm going next. You got an equity, more or less, and where we meet is the restructuring and the risk of cram down on minority investors. That is a real risk in illiquid and with less market structure around it. But I come more from a debt perspective. My background, at least as it relates to emerging markets, is more cross-border financing of infrastructure to get money into the banking system, to finance, commodity export flows, multi-year, 5-year, and that usually relates to picking a good jurisdiction, but there is some real value in that collateral, and eventually you get some collateral offshore that you can trap and mitigate the country risk. So I'm not going to speak from the point of view of how do you mitigate the country risk. I think we should be more generic about how do you, is the jurisdiction attractive, right? What are the features that might make this jurisdiction attractive as a financial center? So with that, I will pull up my comments. So from the question, I imagine the financial center is not one that just attracts liquidity, liquid capital, not a place like Cayman where it's an efficient, cost-efficient and safe place to park your liquidity and trading capital. And I don't mean to pick on Cayman because it's highly used, but I think the context here is, in those types of financial center jurisdictions, the investment destination is not in the country, it's just into the custodian, and you have a global custodian that makes it safe. Whereas here the context is not merely a place to have custody of your trading capital, but a place to deploy that capital, either in the public markets or basically as a trading center as well. And that's a different jurisdictional evaluation. And there, the safety and efficiency of the jurisdiction needs to be augmented significantly, as Charles alluded to and discussed. So, the analogy you made about Bukhara and Samarkand, those were trading centers, and they became financial centers. So I like that analogy. It's sort of like the commodity exchange that has a code of conduct and regulations, and all meant to preserve the integrity of the system, and that becomes more important than any one player. They deal with conventions for delivery and weights and measures, and everything is highly regulated, and they create an environment you can have confidence in, and that environment gets tested. People fail to deliver, they fail to settle, and you test the system and you see that it works. And then membership in that system means you protect it. It becomes paramount for your business, and others can choose to trade off the exchange, but of course they're taking their chances. So I think the trivial part of my answer is that what makes the jurisdiction attractive, if you're going to deploy capital there and not just park it, is that there needs to be an opportunity set, there needs to be a reason to invest in the first place. And I think that there is a large, at least from my perspective, again, there is a big opportunity set here. There is a lot of real wealth that isn't capitalized, isn't certificated and traded, but there is a tremendous amount of opportunities to create real wealth here. And so I guess it meets the first criteria. And we look at things like airport concessions and toll roads and future flow of remittances and merchant voucher flows to earn a high yield. And so it's a rich environment for opportunity. And so this jurisdiction would be a gateway to invest in a potentially good opportunity set. But I think that it bears some discussion, because there's a big difference between illiquid, and we've created a lot of illiquid paper, but illiquid direct investments that you can overcome all the jurisdictional not all of them, but you can overcome many jurisdictional shortcomings with complex bilateral agreements and guarantees, and that have change of law provisions in them, and you have teams of lawyers that will get the terms and enforceability because you're dealing with the government directly, bilaterally, et cetera. You're having them legislate specific laws to cover your specific investment. And that's very different than portfolio interest, coming here, buying up paper as a portfolio investor, and then that is a lot more about market structure and the legal framework for everybody, and not just the decree that you had issued for your deal. So I think that warrants the discussion. So to finish up the trivial part of the answer, it's that the main thing here is that the capital markets really need to develop further. If you want to attract portfolio investment, you need to have a capital markets depth. You need to have capitalization. It's cheaper to get concessionary financing and leverage and not build a liquid, deeper capital market that then helps you have a financial system. And it's not a chicken and egg thing because, the market capitalization, if I'm not mistaken, is about 5 billion. Atabek, you probably know better than me.
Market capitalization
Market cap.
on the stock exchange? You should
Yeah.
be asking the head of the... But
Yeah.
when I think it was like $5 billion market
Okay.
cap of all the companies.
Okay.
But free float, about 500 million, maybe that changed.
Okay, even more so. That's tiny, right? And you don't have a corporate bond market. You need one. You don't have a market for public or even private placements that will give you some market structure and test your market structure, because that's how you'll build capacity. Because you can legislate all you want, and there's a lot of political will to do it, but you need to build it and test it, not just build it. And like I was saying, it's not a chicken and egg thing, because if the local private institutional investments are not investing in the capital market, then what kind of validation does that provide for foreign investors? So there needs to be capacity building in private equity too. Private equity is going to bring the investment operating discipline into the private sector and feed into the public markets to help them grow. So you need to, not sure how, leave it up to someone else. And then, of course, good market infrastructure for money and securities trading, Charles covered, clearing, strong market regulator. Again, it's about testing the system. And I can't emphasize enough the market infrastructure elements, and I think others will probably talk about them. Then, in terms of more granular jurisdictional features that personally I would spend time diligencing, and again, I preface it saying I'm credit, debt-oriented, structured finance-oriented. I'd say some of the bedrock items are, of course, strong private property law. That's the bedrock. And as it relates to specific assets that are in the investment opportunities, whether it's water rights or whatnot. Security law, clear, efficient methods for perfecting your security arrangements against the obligor and against third parties, and knowing that even in insolvency proceedings, it's going to survive. Enforcement of creditor rights, not just shareholder rights. And you can have your security perfection laws be scattered throughout the legal code where you're not sure what you're relying on. You end up with a weak opinion, legal opinion on your deal. And so there needs to be some harmonization or some way to clear conflicts between, conflicts in law. An insolvency regime that's sufficiently creditor-friendly, that's kind of obvious, and it needs to be predictable and be able to work itself out in a relatively short time frame. You can't use the bankruptcy court to make your investors wait 20 years, and you're still in there operating. Rule of law. Many laws on the books are well written, but untested. And that's pervasive, so I won't dwell on that too much, but the courts, the jurisdiction, they need to be commercial, they need to be practical, and they need to be willing even to interpret English or New York law to work out and adjudicate on a short time frame. And this is a recurring theme because it's not that you want, when you do an investment, you have teams of lawyers looking at it. You don't need to win. You just need to have a predictable outcome. If this risk materialized, we lose. But you can't have unpredictability. You need to know the risks you have, and you need to have predictability in a relatively short time frame. So you need to have legal, valid, enforceable, documentation. And of course, this change of law risk. I'll be very brief. Some of the other ones, of course, are low risk of social unrest and movement of people and goods and convertibility, and these are all on all the lists of things that I don't think you need from me. And then another one I would want to touch on, because maybe I think it is important in assessing credit, when you do credit analysis, character. Credit analysis is a lot about character also, the character of the system, as you, I think, called it, the business environment that you're in. And some environments, it's a sport to exploit foreign investors. And in some environments, it's the complete opposite. There's some transactions we did in Japan that you can't do anywhere else. That's just, that's that reliable in that particular sector. So character of that business environment is important. It's not only about the ability to pay and the value of the assets that you're financing, but the willingness to pay and to preserve the integrity of that business environment. And I could see from yesterday in the plenary session, the political will is very strong to create that environment. And so, of course, that's a good sign, but has to be tested. Yeah, I think you don't have to nail it perfectly, but sometimes you add mitigants. Like in a deal, there's diversion risk where things get difficult, and all of a sudden your assets are being diverted somewhere else. So it's a balance. You structure the deal so that even when it blows up, the debtor's still going to get some of that money to keep them operating, and you align interests. So it doesn't have to be a perfect, airtight set of laws and arrangements, but you need to be able to have a predictable outcome. And I think that's more or less my comments on the question. I apologize if I went over.
Thank you, Alfredo. Thank you, Charles. And some very important proposals and assessment have been stated to be taken into account in the current economic development program. In this regard, I would like to address to the representatives of the state authorities that form the financial and the business infrastructure in Uzbekistan. Ilhom, the work that you are doing with your colleagues in the ministry is directly aimed at creating an environment for national and global business. And three questions. What's on the agenda now? To what extent is the development of the financial sector included in the agenda? And what priorities for the development of the business environment are included in the current goals of the ministry? Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Alona. First of all, I want to say thank you to all panelists and their valuable contribution, and the recommendations and the visions and views that you are sharing is very important for us and will be, of course, taken into account. Answering the question, I want to come a bit from further, in the sense that the colleagues, they mentioned about the risks and reasons to invest, and I would say that what what are the strong, let's say that the fundamentals to develop the financial center in Uzbekistan and make it more like a kind of an international financial center, etc., etc. What are the opportunities? But what are the kind of natural driving force behind that? The first thing is that we have to look at the economic program and the program of economic reforms. I mean, in Uzbekistan, last 6 or 7 years, we have been emphasizing the role of reducing the role of the government in the economy. First of all, bringing down the participants participation of the SOEs or SOBs by privatizing, transforming them, and also increasing the efficiency and productivity. So these are the things, and how development of the financial center can help there. The second thing is that the high level of economic growth was mainly supported from channeling the financial resource for external borrowing with the active participation of the government. So the second is that in some sense SOEs, they started to issue Eurobonds. They started to negotiate directly with the global banks, and they started to bring the credits to the economy. So lending channel and fiscal kind of expansion. So that was a supportive. But what will be the next stage? So is it a continuous process? No. So we cannot continue like massively borrow. I mean the government or the SOEs and SOBs, they also have some limited, space and covenants. And so what will be the answer for that challenge as well? So this is the second thing. The another thing is that we come from the more on the policy side, monetary policy and fiscal. Let's talk about the monetary policy. The monetary policy in terms of increasing its efficiency, introducing the inflation targeting, was so far successful, but the further success, in my view, depends on the development of the domestic financial market, in a sense of to allow the transmission channels to work properly and also mobilize the liquidity, and etc. And from my own experience working at the central bank and at the Ministry of Economy, I look at the fundamentals, but sometimes it's very hard to even having that strong fundamentals to develop the market. I can recall our own experience where the government budget started to come with the deficit, and at the same time, banks, they had excess liquidity, but we didn't have the market for a domestic market for government bonds. And we started to work with the Ministry of Finance at that time. I was at the central bank, and we invited the commercial bankers and said, okay, we are going to issue 6 months, 1 year, or 2 year. I might make a mistake with the maturity now. And we explained them, look, you have excess liquidity, which is you are not earning now, and you can invest in these government bonds. They are liquid. You can count them towards the liquidity ratio. You can use them once you are borrowing from the central bank. And of course, you can earn for them. So very good opportunities. And we didn't see a huge interest from commercial banks. And so we went to, like in a nice way, saying, to distort some rules, in the sense that we said, okay, we can, as a central bank, we can prove to you, if you want to sell it back in the secondary market, we will guarantee that you will buy, you can sell it at the value that you bought. And because of the fear at that time, and because of the lack of the transformation of the mindset at the banking, among the, let's say, treasury players at the banks, so it helped. And there was a huge interest, and then the papers, the bonds, they went very quickly in the market, very quickly. So after around maybe 6 months, that distortion was taken away. So there is no, so the market is actually functioning properly as it is now. It should be, in the normal way, so the price is determined during the trading. So it was done. What I want to say is that, even if you have a strong fundamentals, for that, it's sometimes very hard to bring new reforms, which requires a lot of, I'm sorry, but I might be a kind of it requires some neurosurgery as well. It's a transformation of the mindset. So it takes some time. Everyone is saying about capacity building. Yes, it is important. And what I want to say is that we have very strong macroeconomic fundamentals. We are a growing economy, and despite the fact that the world economy is having some difficulty, and the global markets having some difficulty, and we also see that difficulty on ourselves, we have some key strong sides that will support the economic growth. The first is that several bottlenecks such as the energy system. You slowly reform the market. You will increase the energy efficiency. You will sort out the problem with a high level of energy resource you are using for per capita, GDP production. So it will give a kind of a extra bonus for economic growth. The second is the infrastructure thing, is that the connectivity, transport, IT, all of them, you probably could travel to Samarkand, to Bukhara, and could face some issues of getting the tickets, etc. So the number of domestic and foreign tourists are increasing, the infrastructure is developing, but there is a feeling that we are lagging behind. We have to invest more and more and more. So it will, taking out these distortions or the sorting out the bottlenecks, they will provide the economic growth, huge reserve. The third is that it's not the gold mines, copper mines, the other things. Our wealth is a growing population and a young population. We are, unfortunately, sometimes we have to confess and reckon that we export very low-skilled workers. And we have a very good potential, by investing in our young generation, young people, to increase the value added by them into the economy. So that's one of the priorities of the government, and I think we have a very good, strong potential. Looking back at the macroeconomic indicators, strong fiscal and international buffers could be very interesting for the investors. So that's on higher level of the macroeconomic risks. But I fully agree with the risks that are more relevant with the infrastructure. Currently, I will go back to the example how we were having a difficulty, to develop the bond market. Now we have a plan for this year to increase the size. The expectation is $2 billion US dollar equivalent of domestic bond market. But there is a fundamental now. There is a natural thing that we have to quickly open the market for non-residents. We said, okay, let's do amendments and do a legislative change that open the non-residents market. Once we opened, the non-residents are a bit reluctant and say that we need a good infrastructure, such as like depository, international depository company, a custodian service, and we started to talk to Clearstream and some other governments who brought the Clearstream and who can also facilitate and be a kind of a partner in this situation. A lot of interests from the big foreign companies. We met several of them when we were in Washington, beginning of this month. and we feel that there is a gap. So bond market is developing, yeah, and the central bank projection is, downward U-shape because the target is still around 5%. Yes, they postponed the target, but still they have a strong intention to reach that because of the recent situation in the global markets. But when you issue the longer maturity, it's kind of going, a normal U-shape, upward U-shape. So we need more professional players in the market, and so from that perspective, we are very willing to open the market, and we fully agree that investors' concerned about the lack of the infrastructure or the problems with infrastructure, and I think. Despite the fact that some investors are offering, it's interesting in the sense that they say, okay, let's issue in Europe for now, a 10-year maturity. We can swap it once you have an infrastructure, and then, once you have you can issue the domestic, and we can swap it if it is lower interest rates. So it's, but we are still, I'm just telling it that there is a strong will for the investors to invest in Uzbekistan. But being the representative of the Ministry of Economy and Finance, I want to say that there is a growing consensus that, yes, we need a financial resource to bring it because it's important for the privatization, direct portfolio, etc. Yes, there is a good understanding, but there is also a strong growing consensus that the becoming the participant of this financial market is not only the financial resource that we want to mobilize, because yes, so the SOEs who are being privatized or transformed, now they cannot enjoy the benefit from the Ministry of Finance or from the government because the former, previously they were getting some subsidies, some incentives, etc. No. Or the direct credits. Now the limitation is, many things is limited for them. So they have to go to the market. Yes, they go. But from the government perspective, we see it's a good opportunity to increase the competitiveness of the economy. Even, let's say that Navai Mining Company, which is the strategic company, which will be held by the state, and only 2% could be for IPO, but it's not the main aim is not to increase, to mobilize the resource for the state-owned company. This company can go, to different international banks for borrowing a short time, some syndicated loans or some bridge loans, or issue their own corporate bonds. But it's about disciplining them. The corporate governance, you can be accountable. You have to be always looking at your the share price. Are you doing good or you are doing worse? And so you have to follow your financial indicators, etc., etc. So it's relevant to other state-owned companies or some other banks. That's from that perspective, the financial markets are also important. Sorry, I have talked too much, but that's the general view from our side. And of course, I want to say that there is no other way. No other way. If we want to develop, so we will have to develop the financial market. And one of my good essays that I had a difficulty in my master's course was whether to bring empirical evidence whether financial liberalization was driving the economic growth or economic growth was driving the financial development. So still they go hand in hand with each other, and it's very hard to imagine one without the another. So if you want to grow, if you want to have a strong and stable economic growth, we have to develop the financial market and be a gradual and sequential in reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. Very important contribution. And you have mentioned that the financial infrastructure is essential. And I would like to pass the floor to George, who represents Tashkent Stock Exchange. George, what is the exchange doing in this direction concerning all these plans that will be mentioned by Ilhom? Thank you.
Thank you, Alena. I think enough has been said by Charles and by you know about the risks which investors are facing in any market, and Uzbekistan is obviously no exception. You know, counterparty risk, property rights, legislative risks, etc., etc. So I'm not gonna repeat that. I'm gonna simply try to address each of them one by one and tell everyone what we're doing in that direction. First of all, market infrastructure. Let me speak about that. We are now in the process of merging two CSDs. Currently, we have a silo approach in this country where government bonds are settled and custodied in the currency exchange, which is different from our exchange. And equities and corporate bonds are traded and settled, in another CSD, which is basically working. It's our partner at the Tashkent Stock Exchange. So these are like two separate markets, completely segregated from each other, which is not good. I mean, Uzbekistan is not a huge market, and you want to see as much concentration of trading in one place as possible, and also as little, silo approach as possible. So therefore, we're gonna merge two CSDs. There will be one CSD in the country where you will have all securities settled and custodied, from government bonds to equities to corporate bonds, which is gonna create a lot of efficiency and synergies. Number two, we're trying to introduce a concept of settlement in central bank's money. Currently, all trades which are conducted on the Tashkent Stock Exchange in equities and corporate bonds, they settle not through the central bank, but from one of the commercial banks. Yeah, it's a big bank, it's a state-owned bank, but it's still a commercial bank. So there is theoretically always a risk that that bank may default, which is going to bring down the entire capital market infrastructure. So the best approach and the best international practice says that trades should settle through the central bank. And that, of course, requires a lot of legislative changes and a lot of technical changes in order to enable access of CSD to the central bank payment system. But we're working in that direction, and I'm very happy to say that central bank is very supportive of this idea. We are planning to introduce the concept of the settlement banks. And the settlement banks will effectively be sort of conduits for all those, for channeling all those funds for the settlement. Then the next one is going to be enabling paying dividends and coupons via CSD. Currently, you may be surprised, but issuers are trying to pay dividends and coupons to shareholders or bondholders individually. So if you are a successful company, joint stock company, you have let's say 5,000 shareholders, imagine you have to make 5,000 separate transfers to 5,000 different shareholders into their bank accounts. It's a huge, back office work, and nobody wants to do that. And there are many other issues which come with that. Some dividends may get forgotten, some investors complain they never got the dividend, etc. So obviously the best practice is to make all those payments go through the central, through the CSD, Central Securities Depository. And that also is one of our plans to make sure that that happens. Let's not forget about linking international markets and international investors to our local market, and for that we need to set up a link with global custodians and global ICSDs, and Deputy Minister Mr. Narkulov already mentioned that we are working very closely with Clearstream. We have a very strong support from the government, from the central bank for that. Clearstream visited Uzbekistan in January, and it's basically work in progress. So hopefully within next 1 year, we will have a Clearstream link set up in this country. First, it's going to work for government bonds, because this is usually how Clearstream starts entering any market anywhere in the world. But the next, of course, the next logical step would be for that link to start working for equities and corporate bonds. And once that happens, then you can have any investor from any place in the world investing in local securities in a safe and efficient way. Exercising voting rights, that will come hopefully together with fixing this dividend payment thing I mentioned, and not forget about property rights and counterparty risk. Well, counterparty risk is a tough sort of tough issue. You cannot crack it right away. You have to have a central counterparty in the country, like CCP, which is going to take in the entire counterparty risk. We think that Uzbekistan is not ready yet for that because it's a luxury which even much bigger markets cannot afford at the moment. But there are some other ways to mitigate that risk through like introducing DVP, delivery versus payment process in the settlement, etc. Another sort of obstacle I would like to mention is FX risk. Even though it is allowed in Uzbekistan for foreign investors to buy dollars and transfer them abroad to repatriate funds, the process is very manual and very slow. And banks sometimes require a lot of paperwork from brokers to actually convert, Uzbek sums into dollars and to transfer them abroad. Again, it works, but it works inefficiently, and we want to fix that as well. As for the property rights and need for harmonization of laws, which Dino mentioned, enforcement of securities market law, obviously these are things which are critical, but unfortunately we as a stock exchange cannot control that process. It has to be done, by people in the government who can make sure that, and the regulator, I think, the regulator has to play a very important role, because whenever a regulator sees that somebody does not uphold the shareholders' rights and minority shareholders are not protected, they should intervene, if necessary, even take a company to the court. And then you have a court issue that judges, are they knowledgeable enough to really hear the case? And these are sometimes very complex financial issues which judges have to understand really well in order to make a ruling. So I think this is a bigger issue and bigger problem, but I know that the government is trying to fix that as well. And yesterday the president at this forum mentioned that they are trying to set up an arbitration court in Tashkent, which is, I think, a very important step in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, very valid input. Karen, Robert, you are an active participant of the Uzbek financial market. How do you assess the current status of the market, and what do you recommend to the officials to do to develop the market? You can decide in what order you would like to answer the question.
I'll keep my remarks brief. Just to give you a little bit of background, at our heart, we're a money management firm. We invest in emerging and frontier markets. We've got a half dozen offices in North America and a few in South America. And we're here in Uzbekistan because of the opportunity. Invited here approximately 3 years ago, actually by Mr. Atabek Nazirov here. He signed our broker-dealer license here 2 years ago. And so we're in the trenches here, helping to build capital markets. And just briefly, I had a lot of notes prepared about the state of capital markets and what we're focusing on and how we're trying to develop those. But I'll just shorten them and be brief and say that. So focusing on the government is many of the companies have been taken to private placement, and then there's those that are on the list to go to IPO. And a lot of investors in the room might be surprised to actually know how many companies have actually been privately placed. We've been involved in several of those. There's been dozens of companies taken to private placement. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been raised, and that's happening right now, and it continues to happen. On the IPO front, it's gone a little slower. I know there's probably investors in the room that have been watching for the last 3, 4, 5 years, watching Uzbekistan, waiting for IPOs, for all the big privatizations to happen. It's not that it's not going to happen, it's just that it's taking a little longer. And that's an undeniable fact. but it is happening. And I can tell you from being here in the trenches, the government is very committed to capital markets and to local capital markets. And it's why we're here too. I mean, privatizations. The tragedy for Uzbekistan would be to bring 1,000 state-owned companies private and not build local capital markets in the process. I mean, it's such a rare opportunity that a country has to build local capital markets, and we're here not just for the being involved in privatizations, but we look forward to participating in the ongoing capital markets that will be built, and to asset-backed securities, to bring private companies public, to bring debt, to bring structured product. And so we're here for the long haul, and I can tell you that it is developing. We can talk later. I'll just for brevity of time, I won't go into all the things that are happening, but things are happening. Maybe I'll just close with an analogy, and maybe the reason that you're all in the room is because of the opportunity in Uzbekistan. If you looked at South Korea, that everyone knows it's a G15 country today. 40 years ago, if you looked at South Korea, the population of South Korea compared to Uzbekistan was almost identical. And the GDP per person in Uzbekistan today and South Korea then was almost identical as well. And we've seen what South Korea has done during those 40 years. And it didn't take 40 years. It actually happened South Korea has been in a good position for a long time. And I think Uzbekistan will get there as well. Just as a comparison, going back 40 years, those first 10 years, it was the 80s, and so a lot of countries did well. The United States, it was a booming stock market. South Korea outperformed the United States by 50% during that same time period. And I think that's just like in South Korea, Uzbeks are well educated, they're hardworking. I would argue that the actual GDP per person is higher than is stated. And so the opportunities are here. It's just the rocket is on the platform. It's just getting the platform built just properly before we light that rocket. And it's in the works. It's happening, and we can talk later about some of the things that are happening on a day-to-day basis here in Uzbekistan.
Karen, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the conversation today, and I could quote and comment for next 2 hours, but I will try to be shorter. So I guess, first of all, Dina established the motto for me for all further discussions with the state authorities, because not the chicken and egg question, it will be the first phrase I will be speaking in any other meetings. We don't need to create the bicycle to develop the market. Everything is quite simple. We just need to implement this. And as Deputy Minister Nargulov said, as soon the market got the guarantees, the market starting to grow. It's related to the state debt securities, but why it cannot be applied to the equities, stock market, and everything else. So the idea of the Tashkent Financial Center is very good, but probably it will take a very solid, very long-term, sustainable approach on developing of this. To create 50,000 well-educated job places, it will take tens of years. And it cannot be, this process cannot be affected by the changes in fiscal, budget, administrative reforms. So to keep this interest and to keep this sustainable growth and changes, I guess we also should spend the time on developing of the current market to allow our guests to start be not just a guest but investors as well. And for this there is a few quite similar and quite simple things to be done, but unfortunately for the last 5 years we didn't do it. So just to name it, allow omnibus accounts. Don't try to control every investor. Allow international brokers to come and help their investors to come here to the market through the one account. There is brave enough investors who want to come today, not in 5 years, not where we will have the clear stream or something. They want to come now, and they want to have these guarantees that this IPO program will be realized properly, that the big companies will go tomorrow to the international markets, that the rule of law will be the #1 for the local and international investors. So I guess for me, financial center idea now is mostly idea about concentrating the resources, the ideas, the strategy, the legislation in one direction for all, for companies, for investors, for government authorities, and this will help to increase the liquidity, increase the market very, it will skyrocket. There is everything here in Uzbekistan: resources, people, very educated people, everything. We're just lacking a small part of good governance in a very short term. Thank you.
Thank you, very important. And let's go on to the world of International Financial Center, because we have some representatives, and it will be interesting to discuss some experience of Uzbekistan in developing financial center. So, Atabek, in 2018, as the head of the Capital Market Agency, you initiated a project to develop the concept of International Financial Center in Tashkent with the assistance of the City UK. And what were the results of this work, and what kind of financial center Uzbekistan needs? Thank you.
Alena, thank you very much. And I also want to thank all the participants around the table. It's good to see old friends still committed and working hard on developing our financial system, and also excited to see the guests who are here, and I'm sure they're here to listen and understand what is the best way, I guess, forward, right? As you mentioned, Alena, about, was it 4 years ago, when I became head of the Capital Market Development Agency, we wanted to progress. We wanted to implement the reform as soon as possible. So we did two things in parallel. Number one, we initiated a review of the existing system, existing infrastructure, regulatory environment, and together with a lot of folks who are here today, came up what we called with the capital market development strategy, which included everything: privatization, concentration of the markets to bring everybody into one place, simplifying regulation, introduction of the powerful regulator who would look after the interest of the investors, etc. But unfortunately, I'll be honest with you, and I'll be honest with all of my colleagues, there was substantial pushback in the government because there were folks who felt differently. So unfortunately, capital market reform didn't go through for reasons, as I've said. I believe personally at that time it was simply a difference of opinions, right? Now, we initiated the idea in parallel, so in that case, if we cannot reform our existing system, can we create something new? And the idea was to create a financial center that would replicate best international practices, that would take on board what many countries around the world have done. So I think at the end of the day, there was no decision made, but it seems to me, in order to implement a successful financial center in Uzbekistan, you need to include the stakeholders. There need to be substantial work done with the people who will benefit from the financial center. And we're talking about population. We talk about the average citizens of Uzbekistan who will be playing a role as investors. And we're talking about professional community. We're talking about investor community. And obviously, the goal is to mobilize capital. The goal is to allow companies to attract capital and help Uzbekistan to facilitate economic growth that everybody in the room is talking about. Unfortunately, so far, the main financiers were IFIs in Uzbekistan. Most of the beneficiaries were the government and the state-owned companies. It is still difficult for private companies to raise capital. Around the world, we know even not even public markets, but most of the funds are raised by private equity. Private equity outpaced over the last 5 years public markets in terms of allocation of capital. But unfortunately, the laws that we do have in Uzbekistan, in my view, not very consistent. And we talk about corporate law. For example, look at joint stock company law, look at the LLC law. Not all of them are easily, let's say, understood and relevant to an international investor base. So one way to develop ecosystem in Uzbekistan, one way to develop, let's say, an infrastructure to attract investments and to mobilize investment is obviously the creation of the Tashkent International Financial Center. I strongly believe that we need Tashkent International Financial Center in Uzbekistan, but would it be something new, or is it something we can incorporate what we already have, including the stock exchange, including the depository system? I think this is for the debate, and my recommendation would be to have more of these kind of dialogues and platforms, involve all the stakeholders from the government, from the parliament, because all of that will require substantial legislative changes, including possibly constitutional changes. And at the end of the day, the more people are involved, the easier it would be for us to make this happen. I can bet 99.9% of citizens of Uzbekistan probably have very little understanding of what is an international financial center. How can we benefit from this? So again, this is maybe lessons learned for me personally, spending 5 years in government. It is difficult to bring together and receive a consensus, but you have to do it. And the sooner we start, the better it is. I know different efforts were done by different government agencies, and the most recent one, I understand, by the Strategic Development Agency, who is conducting a lot of work in that. So again, look at international experience. I mean, some countries did without international financial centers, like Poland, Turkey, Vietnam, very successful domestic capital markets. They didn't have to, let's say, create and mimic common law principles. They've done with their own. But I think what we need to understand in Uzbekistan, what is preventing us from mobilizing successful financial center, making successful financial center happen? Language could be another one. We know that the international investor community uses English language as a primary language to conduct business. So should we adapt English language as our principal language in our contractual discussions in the regulation? So thank you for inviting. Great topic. I wish everyone good luck, and let's keep the momentum. Let's keep these meetings happening. I think it's a very important policy topic for Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Atabek. I guess this roundtable is a way how we could discuss this topic. And I would like to pass the floor to Adalat. So, as some speakers have already mentioned, the level of development of the corporate governments is a key for investors. And traditionally, unfortunately, investors' protection in emerging markets is not at high level. What do you recommend to Uzbekistan concerning your experience in working in the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alena. Pleasure to be here and contribute to this important discussion. So, from the corporate governance point of view, I would like to highlight 3 fundamental issues that would be very important in order to succeed in the development of capital markets, privatization, as well as creation of the financial center in Uzbekistan. So the first issue is the role of the shareholders. And this is what we actually observe not only in Uzbekistan, this is relevant for other countries in the region. What does it mean? It means that for the country, for the government, it is important to form the understanding of who are the shareholders, what's their role, and what their expectations. Well, at the end of the day, the corporate governance as a notion is about separation, ownership from the management. And unfortunately, we do see the lack of understanding this fundamental principle for corporate governance. Yes, shareholders do have the list of rights, and some of them were mentioned. Charles, in fact, mentioned the very important right to receive the information reliable and accurate. So there is a list of rights and a few obligations for the shareholders. And the first one is to provide capital, financing, and the second one is to form the professional governing bodies. So that means that shareholders providing capital, they do delegate the management, the governance of the company to the professional board members and managers. And here I would like to probably say about the universal principle. You can lean on what resists, right? Вы можете опереться на то, что сопротивляется. And this is actually what is important for investors, especially for minority investors, because we want to see a clear and transparent structure and the system of the corporate governance on what we can resist, adequately resist, of course. However, in many cases, and this is relevant for the private businesses, for SOEs, state-owned companies, where shareholders, they are interested in seeing more loyal and convenient board members especially. So this is something where would be important to work on the legislative framework as well as on the mindset. So independent directors and the board as a whole is the most powerful strategic tool in this competitive environment. And of course, one of the most important tool, again, for development of the capital markets and in terms of privatization. And with that, I would like, again, to note the role of independent directors, the understanding of their fiduciary duties, the independent directors' fiduciary duties, the board members' fiduciary duties. This is something what we see as an important step forward in Uzbekistan and other countries of the region, of the Central Asia region. And of course, availability of the professional institute of directors, associations, networks, training and certification programs for the directors. This is something that, again, would be very much needed here in Uzbekistan, and we hope to see more developments. So that was the second point, the professional board members, the professional managers. And the third point is stakeholder approach. We see the global shift, I mean, the shift in seeing the business and doing the business at the global level. So we are going from the shareholder economy to the stakeholder economy, inclusive stakeholder economies. And yesterday at the ESG panel, we discussed, quoting Alice in Wonderland, that you need to run fast in order to stay still. And I believe that this is probably make a case for Uzbekistan in terms of adopting, observing the best practice standards in the corporate governance. As Karen mentioned, there is no need to invent the wheel. So all the solutions, all the recommendations are out there, and I truly believe that there is a great potential for Uzbekistan, and other distinguished panelists mentioned that. And what is needed is, of course, the commitment towards the best practices of corporate governance, and all those 3 points. First, to clarify the role of shareholders, to clarify it in the legislation, because we still need that this is area for improvement, and understanding that the direct interference of shareholders into the governance and management of the organization is not the best practice of a corporate governance. Second, professional board members and managers. And the third is stakeholder approach. And concerning the stakeholder approach, I believe this is also important to understand that, yes, the state, the government is one of the key stakeholders for all of us here. But other players, including people of the country, also should be taken into account. And probably, but this is the separate topic for the separate panel, people's IPO, right? So we can actually consider the people of the country as the source of financing. And we believe that countries in the Central Asia, some of them, they're already at the state where people actually can be brought to the capital market development as well. And for that, we cannot ignore the stakeholder inclusiveness. So I wish that all those reforms would be taken successfully here in the country, and happy to answer the questions, if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Adalat. Kairat, since 2015, you have been creating the IFC project in Astana, neighboring Kazakhstan. How do you assess the effects of the center to the economy of the Kazakhstan, and what do you recommend for Uzbekistan in the way of creating Tashkent as international financial center? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aliona. It's really very similar discussion we did have in Kazakhstan like many years ago, and I do understand that. So it's like it should be very good stakeholders management here in order to make final decisions for the financial centers to be or not to be. I think the part of this discussion is what for we are doing in financial center in Kazakhstan. Been mentioned a few times that for the global investors community is very much important. I think that two main features. So one is the predictability of the national local legislation, and the second one, this legislation should be familiar. And this is something very simple to understand, very difficult to execute in any country. What we decided in 2015 as a part of a huge plan of the comprehensive joint plan of reforms that we should maybe to implement some part of the few times mentioned best international practice. So for those time for the Astana International Financial Center, the benchmark was DIFC, Dubai International Financial Center. Why it was interesting for us to follow Dubai? Because from one side, when you are kind of studying the experience of New York or London, it's like 100 years of history, not sometimes a relevant experience, but in Dubai we started just 20 years ago and achieved a great result just in these 20 years. And the entire idea in Dubai was to implement in the legal enclave of the common law jurisdiction based on the principles of English common law. We did the same. It took us to make amendments to the constitutions of Kazakhstan, which is a very serious political step. And now we do have a one country, two systems. So we have a local legislation which is more close to European continental law, and we have a common law jurisdiction based on a law of Astana International Financial Center. So very important part of this that for the investors community, we do have now very good dispute resolution authorities. So we have two parts of this ecosystem. So one is International Arbitration Center, which we mentioned, which is working on common law, but also on other laws as well. And the other one is a court of AFC based on common law jurisdiction, where we invited the retired British judges, starting from the legendary Lord Wolfe. So the entire idea is that the people, investors, trust to these people, let's say to these judges, and we now had like more than 1,000 cases in the court and in arbitration center, which is, I think, that really bring us to the more deeper understanding of how rule of law in Kazakhstan should work, especially towards the interest of international investors. The other one is jurisdiction, where we created also the separate regulation authorities, which is focusing on financial regulation, more based on experience of the Bank of England and monetary authorities of Singapore, including the sandbox mechanism, which we're focusing on the development of the fintech. And I'm sure that's a part of our fintech companies already also part of this investment forum. And the idea was that we already invited more than 2,000 companies during these 5 years. We will celebrate 5 years this summer, and more than 2,000 companies, more than $7 billion been invested through our de-risking platform. And so we do believe that this is a huge contribution to the economic growth in our country. The other very important issues that have been mentioned about development of the capital markets platform. I think it's very crucial. So I agree that in order to bring trust from international investors, we work with stakeholders like NASDAQ. So NASDAQ, one was a shareholder of our stock exchange. We built it from scratch, and also Shanghai Stock Exchange. So we're working very closely with, we already brought to our country Clearstream, working with the central bank, and we're working with Euroclear. So we have a separate CSD, and this CSD is also working on common law jurisdiction based on the very developed system. And I think that also very much important that financial center creation or even discussion around this shouldn't be separated from the reforms agenda in the country. So it's like IPO, people's IPO, privatization. So everything should be like a part of a consistent plan. It's not a separate agenda. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to develop. We should develop it together. So in my view, starting from your first point, that let's remember it, the Bukhara and Samarkand, and then in the famous book of the Frederick Starr, the Bukhara Samarkand, been mentioned those time global financial centers. I believe that is also was the centers, financial centers those time in Kazakhstan, in Taras, in Turkestan. So these are the idea that it's not like a fashion to create international financial center. I think been mentioned here, Vietnam and Turkey also now thinking about this. Maybe it cannot be common law jurisdiction, but anyway, the idea is that it should be kind of the ecosystem, which would be interesting to the investors. And for Kazakhstan, it's very much important that our neighborhood, the closest strategic partner, Uzbekistan, will continue this reforms agenda. And I think that for the global investors community, we are interested not one by one, we're interested all together as a big region of Central Asia. So the BCG mentions that we will be in 15 years more than 100 million people. And this is like a very interesting market. I agree with the Minister of Economy that it's a strong fundamentals to investors to come and to make business here. And I believe that our leaders, President of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, President of Uzbekistan, Mirziyoyev, are doing a great job in order to unite the region as much as possible. So it's a big region. We'll play a significant role, especially in connecting European Union with China and Southeast Asia. And as more financial centers, so let's say secure de-risking platform place would be here, as more secure would be global trade and investment here. So let me summarize here by the famous slogan, let's make together Silk Road great again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Today we have Mike Wardell from London at ZN Group online. Mike, can you hear us? Okay. Mike, good morning. Yeah. Yeah, we hear you. So thank you for joining us today. Actually, there are already 130 international financial centers in the GFCI index, and ZN is paying a lot of attention to newcomers. And what do you recommend to the emerging centers like Tashkent concerning your work in ZN? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Elena. I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you in person today in Tashkent, but greetings from London. I think a lot of the things that I'm going to comment on have been referred to by some of our earlier speakers. So I'll try not to repeat everything they've said, but I will touch on some of the key themes. One of the things that's come up today, and one thing that I would always recommend to emerging centres, is to ensure that you have trusted institutions. And we've talked about the stock exchange, the regulator, the role of the courts and arbitration, and international investors and any investors actually in a market, local as well, need to feel they can trust those institutions to do their job correctly, and that disputes and any problems will be dealt with fairly. And so a very important point, are those trusted institutions. The second point I was going to make is that financial sector development goes alongside other things. So successful financial centers that we track in our indices are good on human capital, they're good on infrastructure, they're good on financial sector development, on business environment, on a reputation. And you've got to be thinking about the the range of the offer that you make across all those areas. And one of the most important things here is the business environment, as we've heard this morning, and the idea that the environment treats all comers fairly. So whether you're a local businessman or someone from overseas, or whether you're working in this sector or that sector, the system is seen to be to treat everyone the same. The next point I'd make, I guess, is that in order to develop an international financial center, you need to have international people. That means you need to think through what you offer in terms of being a great place to live, but also how easy is it for people with skills to enter the local market through visa schemes and to come and live and make a life in Tashkent. The fourth area to talk about when I'm talking to emerging financial centers is to look for opportunities to leapfrog the established centers. So we see good examples of this in disruptive technologies, but in finance, just looking at ways in which you can take the best of what's gone before, but leapfrog using new technology to do it slightly differently. This might mean making a lot more use of mobile platforms, and I know talking about Astana, the development of mobile trading platforms has been a real success. Being heavily into green finance, looking at ways to do innovative regulation using digital platforms, perhaps using new ways of doing finance, including policy performance bonds, where the bond is raised against the promise of delivery of policy change rather than against use of proceeds. So there's ways in which emerging centers can do things differently and to overtake traditional financial approaches. Finally, and I think this is a really vital way in which to operate, and there's been some discussion of that this morning, and indeed this forum is an example of what I want to talk about. We've done some studies of the financial centers who've performed particularly well over the last 20 years, 30 years. And if you take case studies like Singapore, like Luxembourg, one of the things that marks them out is that they've been highly successful as a financial center in building partnerships between the financial sector and industry, between the public and private sector. And those partnerships have come together to agree a strategic approach to the development of finance in that center. Because any center in its development needs to think about its focus, needs to think about the particular parts of the market where it wants to put effort. And it may be that capital markets is where Tashkent is at the moment, but if everyone agrees on the strategic priorities, that means you can put resource into human capital development, into systemic development, into legislative and regulatory development in that area, and get it very strong before moving on to another area for strategic development. So I'd strongly recommend you build really, really powerful and strong partnerships between the public and private sector, between industry and finance, to make sure that everyone is working from the same page. And this forum, I think, is a really good example of the mechanisms needed to build that kind of partnership. Many thanks for your invitation this morning.
Thank you, Mike. So at the end of the session, the most important topic is reputation, and reputation plays an important role in the development of the financial center. Andrew, the question is for you. Are estimates of individual investors worth a lot? And what do you recommend to Uzbekistan in case of the reputation and the image of the jurisdiction? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alina, and thank you very much for inviting me on the panel today. It's a great honor. And thank you also for saying communications is the most important thing, Alina. I don't think it is, but if you're doing great things and you don't communicate it and tell your story internationally, people are not going to be aware what's happening and the opportunity unless you have a very, very specialist interest in a country. Hudson Sandler is a strategic communications and sustainability agency. We are headquartered in London. We have offices internationally. And Deputy Minister, I'm very pleased to say we opened an office in Tashkent this month. So we're investing in the ecosystem here in Tashkent alongside companies like Mosaic and Avesta, and we want to see investment banks, more legal firms, rating agencies, the whole ecosystem develop here over the coming years and decades. That's the object of the exercise. I was very interested in the President's speech yesterday. There's a lot happening here. It's a very positive story. I wish the UK government would talk more about lower taxes, deregulation, a smaller state, listening to business. So that was a very interesting speech for me. So there's a lot to talk about. But the problem is, Alina, if I'm going to talk about the reputation of Uzbekistan and Tashkent as a financial center, there's very, very little data for me to get my head around. There's very, very little discussion about it internationally. If I look at Uzbekistan as a travel and tourist brand, that's much more active. There's a lot of data. Great initiatives like the splendors of Uzbekistan's Oasis in Paris recently generated a lot of discussion, a lot of interest. When I look at the data around capital markets, investing in this country is very, very sparse. If I look at the Financial Times over last year, I found 2 articles on Uzbekistan, one on Russians opening bank accounts here, one on well-known businessmen dealing with sanctions. Nothing around the topics we are talking about. A bit more in Bloomberg. If I look at the social media discussions around Uzbekistan, outside the country, I see 4,400 mentions, all about geopolitics, all about tourism, very, very little about investment and capital markets. So there's very, very little data. And before I came here, I spoke to the leading emerging market opinion writer at the Financial Times and asked him, what do you know about Uzbekistan? What do you think of Uzbekistan? And he said, I know very, very little. I think it's where exotic bonds are traded, was his only comment. So we start with a relatively blank sheet of paper, which is good. It's an opportunity to write your own story and tell your own story. The problem is, you start from a position with this vacuum where I think a lot of the people you want to influence in the media, investors, analysts, still have an out-of-date view of the country. They're still looking at this country as closed and cautious about international engagement. You have to make a real effort to find out what's happening here. Now, I think that can be changed quite quickly. And I think there are 2 things, by way of example, that could be looked at. At the moment, there's no, what I would call as a communications specialist, there's no compelling hook into the story. There's a lot happening technically, there's a lot of laws being changed, there's a lot of good things happening at the stock exchange, but actually for people to stand up and take interest in this country, you need a much stronger hook. And I think, as I say, there are 2 areas I think, in my mind, you could look at. I think the first thing the government needs to demonstrate internationally is its ability to act in financial markets beyond bond issuance. You mentioned the story of South Korea, and it's been a tremendous story over the last 40 years, but also I look at Egypt, and I think that 40 years ago, Egypt had the same GDP as South Korea. For the last 10, 15 years, Egypt has been talking about privatization of state assets and IPOing its state assets, and it's just not happened. And people have lost interest and no longer want to engage on the subject. In a way, it's discredited the government because it has not been able to act and deliver investment opportunities. So I think a listing of a major state asset, by way of example, Navoy, internationally in Tashkent, would be a very, very strong signal that the country is open for business. That would bring institutional investors to the country to look at the country more broadly. Analysts would write research on that company. The media would be interested in that company. So there's an example. If you can deliver an international IPO on one of the top assets, as the President said yesterday was the intention of the government, I think that could be transformational in a very short period of time. I was also very interested, Minister, by the comments that were made, I think, earlier this year about establishing a Uzbekistan National Investment Fund, where I think the reports where you're talking to Franklin Templeton are involved in this, and the idea is that a number of minority shareholdings would be put into a fund, and that fund itself would be listed locally and internationally, possibly in London. It's a model that other countries have followed, Romania being an example, And again, it gives international investors an opportunity to actually invest in a basket of business, have additional liquidity, and for the international media, international analysts to actually begin to understand what's happening in the country. So I think it's quite critical to get this attention and to have this hook that there is an equity opportunity for the international community on the horizon, beyond bond issuance. The second area I was just going to briefly highlight, because I know we're running over time, is I think there are a number of areas where the company benchmarks very strongly against international peers, and where this is validated by highly respected international agencies. Just pick one example, the World Bank Doing Business Index. Now, Uzbekistan, last time I looked, ranked about 67. That was a few years ago. It would be higher now. The trajectory is in the right direction. But within that, it's ranking much higher around areas like starting businesses, getting power, interestingly, gentlemen, protecting minority shareholders, and enforcing contracts. In fact, in the area of protecting minority shareholders, it ranks 37th. The US ranks 36th. In the area of enforcing contracts, Uzbekistan ranks 22, the UK ranks 34. So I think these are very interesting statistics, and if you're looking to invest in a country and you want solid protection and you want to be enforced contracts, there is a good story to tell. But you need to tell the story. You need to be out in forums. The London Stock Exchange has an Uzbek forum in June. It'd be great to see state agencies there talking about this story. You need to tell your story to the media more actively. There has been some good work, but I think there's much more that could be done. Talking to investors directly, inviting them here, educating them about Uzbekistan. So I think, I'd say in summary, I think an equity opportunity could be transformational, but I think there's an opportunity to talk much more actively about the independent international endorsement of what's happening in the country to begin to get that story, to begin to get more traction around it.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everyone. So I guess there is very complex discussion on creating Tashkent International Financial Center, and we will be glad to see active participation of all speakers and guests in the creation of the Tashkent International Financial Center. Thank you.